Hey everyone and welcome back. In this video I'll discuss the basics on how to obtain moss from local sources and how to propagate it for prolonged use in terrariums and vivariums. This is a general care guide that outlines techniques suitable for various types of moss. These are the techniques that I personally use and have found to be extremely effective. As you well know, I almost always use moss in my terrarium and vivarium builds. Propagating your own moss is extremely easy to do, and it's very useful, especially if you create as many projects as I do. Even if you don't create very frequently, it's still wise to propagate your own moss. The three main benefits include convenience, safety, and success. Did you know that there are over 10,000 species of moss? It's true, and although they are found in various conditions, most can acclimate quite well and thrive in very moist environments. Luckily for us, that's exactly the type of environment found in a terrarium or vivarium. That said, when propagating moss, one of the most important factors to consider is moisture. Moss will grow very quick and dense when provided enough water. However, if you don't provide enough, it will quickly dry up and in many cases die for good. If you can get this down, you will become a green thumb in no time. Before we can do anything though, we need to get some moss. You can find moss pretty much anywhere. You can order it online, gather it from the forest, find it in your yard, or even pick it from the cracks of a sidewalk. I'm an opportunistic gatherer and have been known to grab a patch of moss wherever and whenever I see it. Just keep your eyes peeled and you'll notice it just about anywhere. Today I'm gathering various types of moss from the woods behind my house. I've extensively explored these woods, so I know exactly where certain types of moss grow. When harvesting, I never completely remove any patch of moss. I do this so that I can continually return to the same spots, and of course so that I don't deplete the resources completely. Think of it as sustainable harvesting. A good way to do this is to grab some moss from the middle of a patch, and then fluff the moss over the void that was just created. It's like nothing was ever removed. Or simply take a little bit from the edges like so. There's moss everywhere, so no need to be greedy with a single patch. Now that we have some moss, we can take it home and get it prepared for the next step. First and foremost, we are going to need a container and some form of purified water. Generally, I use tap water treated with drops, like these Repti-Safe drops. You could also use reverse osmosis water, spring water, distilled water, or rainwater to name a few. Fill up your container with a decent amount of water. Then submerge your moss and let it soak. The reason that we are doing this is to remove any debris and as many hitchhikers as we possibly can. Soaking the moss will also rehydrate it if it's a little on the dry side. Anyway, set this container aside and let the moss soak while we do the next few steps. For the next part, we need a tight sealing container. Anything that will hold humidity and has a transparent lid will work fine. I used to use aquariums with a plastic lid, but I switched to Tupperware containers for convenience. I got this 20-quart Tupperware container for about $6, so the cost is really cheap and you could always reuse it for something else later on. Now that we have a suitable container, we can move on to our drainage layer, which I usually refer to as a false bottom. Here I simply have some gravel, but you could use various materials to make your false bottom. Regardless of what you use, you don't need very much of it. This layer will mostly help perpetuate the water cycle, but it will also keep the substrate from getting too soggy from exposure to water. About a half an inch of your drainage element should be sufficient. Afterward, we need something to keep the substrate separate from the false bottom. I have some carbon fiberglass window screen, which is what I typically use. There are a lot of materials that you could use for this part, and here's a little list that I compiled for you. Regardless of what you use as a mesh barrier, we have to cut it to size. As I stated in past videos, when you cut mesh for your projects, you should cut it slightly larger than the size of the bottom of your container. I'll show you why in just a second. Also, I like to cut my mesh using an X-Acto knife, but you could use scissors as well. Once your mesh is cut, simply place it in your container so that the excess curls up the sides. This will prevent any substrate from sneaking down in between the mesh and the side of the container. Now we have to add a purification element. This will help keep the water as clean as possible when it passes down into the false bottom. It also helps prevent mold buildup, which is always a possibility in an enclosed environment like this. Your best option is either activated carbon or lumpwood charcoal. I suggest using lumpwood charcoal because it's really cheap by volume, but if you only need a little bit, then activated carbon might be your best bet. Put in a thick layer of your purification element. This enclosure will remain very moist at all times, so we need to ensure that the environment is as fresh as possible, and this layer will do exactly that. Next we can add the substrate layer. I prefer to use my typical tropical substrate mix because it remains fluffy even in very moist conditions. Follow the link to learn more about it. However, it doesn't matter what type of substrate you use. Generic potting soil like this or even dirt from outside will work as well. If you use dirt from outside, I highly recommend sterilizing it before use. You can do so by baking it at 350 degrees for about 15 minutes in the oven. Additionally, if your intent is to use these mosses for vivariums that will house animals, definitely do not use dirt from outside. Anyways, put a thin layer of substrate into your container. It doesn't need to be very thick since most mosses simply grow on top of the substrate. Once your substrate is in place, lightly mist it to even out the surface and to keep it from sticking to the moss later on. Now we can return to our moss. As you can see, the water is extremely murky and has a lot of particles floating around. I doubt that yours will get this dirty as most of it came from the sphagnum moss. Regardless, this should illustrate why it's a good idea to clean the moss in the first place. Now get another container full of clean water and transfer the moss into this one. If you notice any debris as you transfer the moss, be sure to remove what you can. Keep repeating this process until the water remains pretty clean when you transfer the moss from container to container. As stated earlier, the whole point of this process is to remove as much foreign materials as possible. Even though this is pretty effective at removing most pests, it doesn't effectively remove microbes. That said, if your intent is to use moss obtained from outside in a vivarium with animals, do so at your own discretion. Personally, I've never had anything adverse happen, but the potential is there. In regards to this, I follow two rules of thumb. I always keep my mosses for a few months before adding them to a setup intended for animals. Also, I only use moss from outside in newly established tanks before adding the animals rather than adding it later on. These steps won't guarantee that nothing will happen, but any precaution that can be taken should. Also, if you're simply using your moss for a terrarium, you don't have to be concerned with anything. In fact, you don't need to sterilize your moss in the first place, but it's never a bad idea. Once your moss is good to go, simply place it in your container. You don't need to bury it in the substrate or anything like that. I prefer to keep my mosses in patches based on the type. You can also break a larger piece of moss into smaller sections to promote faster growth. Once your moss is in place, give your container a thorough misting. I should also mention that if you want to add any sort of microfauna such as springtails or isopods, you can do so as well. Now I will briefly go over lighting. Moss isn't very picky, it grows in bright light or in low light. I've used various CFL bulbs, a 9.5 watt LED bulb which is equivalent to 40 watts, and this 15 watt T3 light fixture. However, at this point I strictly use LED bulbs. They seem to work the best, are more efficient, and create minimal heat. You can set your light directly on top of the container, but I suggest propping it slightly above the container like so. I have my lights on a 10-hour on and 14 off light cycle. Any alteration to this cycle shouldn't make much of a difference. The last thing that I will cover is water. After you initially water your enclosure, you should only have to water the moss about once a month. These containers hold moisture extremely well. Simply monitor the moss, and if it looks like it could be drying out, add a little bit of water. The only time you should have to spray a lot of water is initially. Every other time after that, you can spray a little bit. All of the mosses that you saw me use are temperate. However, they acclimate to the environment of a terrarium and vivarium without dying back quite nicely. The only type that I don't have the best luck with is pillow moss. It will do great initially and then kind of die off. I don't think that this type of environment is suitable for it long term. Anyways, that about sums up this demonstration. As you can see, this process is really quite simple. I hope that you learned something useful from this demonstration, and as always, thank you for watching.